Well, thank you very much, Glenn. I've just put this picture up at the beginning to show you what I used to work on. I used to work on trees and their adaptation, and I looked at adaptation in trees across Scotland, and Scots pine trees, and I also worked on diseases of trees. So that's where my so-called expertise lies. But my attitude to science is broader than that, and I believe that I'm a biologist, and I can look at any kind of paper in science, especially in biology, and I can read that paper and I can make some sense of it and I can criticize it. And I think that's the way that the world should be. And we shouldn't be divided up into experts who are only able to talk about a very specific thing. And the problem with that is that we need to be able to put together the bits of information that we have, synthesize them, and really understand the world, and not understand some tiny part of it in which you are just an expert. I wanted to start with this quotation from Xenophanes, and this is something which I had at the beginning of my PhD thesis, to remind me that I wasn't able to tell anyone the truth. And I'm not able to tell you the truth today because the gods did not reveal from the beginning all things to us, but in the course of time, through seeking, we may learn and know things better. As for certain truth, no man has known it, nor shall he know it, neither of the gods, nor yet of all the things of which I speak. For even if by chance he were to utter the final truth, he would himself not know it. For all is but a woven web of guesses. And I guess that's my attitude to science. I'm trying to get closer to the truth. I know I won't get there, but I guess my life has been devoted to trying to find out more about the world and the real world, not some make-believe world that's in a model somewhere. It's about the real world. Now, I titled this talk an ecological perspective, and I just wanted to remind you of what ecology is. Ecology is not just tree hugging. It's the study of the interactions between organisms and between organisms and their environment. And the idea in ecology is that we're trying to explain why we have particular organisms in one particular place, how those organisms interact with one another, why we find certain large numbers of individuals in certain times, how those numbers fluctuate, and so on. So it's a very broad discipline. Why do I think that I can actually tell you anything about health? Because that's not my expertise. Well, a lot of health is to do with the interactions between our bodies and the environment and the organisms with which we interact. So actually health is an ecological question. And for the medics to carve it up and say that's our subject is completely wrong. It's a subject which should be open to anybody, and it should be especially open to ecologists to have a look at. Now, what I want to do, my motivation for giving this talk, is to challenge the model of disease that we've been taught. And I think that I've got there 4 points there, which I think kind of sum up what the media would like you to believe about disease. And the first of this, that we're universally vulnerable to potentially damaging organisms. We're potential victims, and we're vulnerable. The second point they try to make is that we're only healthy if we're free of these organisms. And we saw that with I'm not going to call it a pandemic because it wasn't a pandemic. We saw it in the last 4 years because people were religiously going around and trying to remove these other organisms from themselves with all kinds of nasty chemicals. And they obviously believe that they're not healthy unless they're rid of all these other organisms. The third thing that we're being told is that we somehow need help from pharmaceuticals or for some injections in order to protect ourselves from these potentially dangerous organisms. And the fourth thing that we've been taught, and increasingly it's being pushed on us at the moment, that there's this fear that hangs over us. Disease-causing entities can evolve at any time, and they can be created in biolabs, and they can be so deadly, and they can circle the globe in a matter of days. And that's all the things like monkeypox, disease X, we're being pushed to believe that such a thing exists. So I want to counter that. So let's take an ecological perspective on the human body. So let's consider the human body is a resource to be exploited by other organisms. Loads of good stuff in the human body: proteins, fats, carbohydrates, loads of good stuff. And there's a whole lot of organisms which interact with us and would like to get hold of those. So we want to look at the interactions between the human body, and I've got a number of types of organisms there. We've got helminth worms, we've got fungi, we've got protozoa, single-celled animals, we've got bacteria, and we've also got, at the end there, more controversially, a parasitic molecule. And what I want to do today is to have a look at what defenses do we actually have against these, when do problems arise, and I want to have a look at dedicated parasites, organisms which are dedicated to exploiting the human body and overcoming its defenses. And then I want to draw some conclusions with some implications. So let's consider the human body. What are the barriers against invasion of that human body? Well, I've listed 4 here. We've got your skin is a really significant barrier. Then your body, an outside bit of your body, is the the lining of your respiratory system, your lungs, etc. Then there's the lining of the gut, which is actually a bit which is a barrier between the outside world and your body. And then we've got the urinary and reproductive lining, the lining of that tract. So there are different barriers to these potentially disease-causing organisms coming in. Let's just have a look at these barriers. Here's the skin. Well, the skin is a very dry and acidic environment. It's got on the surface, it's got a layer of keratin, which is the substance which forms your toenails and your fingernails. And that is only accessible. Keratin can only really be broken down by a very limited number of organisms, mainly fungi. The skin is also an incredibly active part of your body. It's replaced every 45 days or so. So there's continual production and damage which has been done is being put right the whole time. So it's a very dynamic system. Then we can have a look at the respiratory system and the lining of that respiratory system. And this diagram shows the cells of the respiratory system, and at the top would be the air within your lungs. And what have we got here? We've got the cells, and then we've got on the cells they have things called like little hairs, which are called cilia, and above that we've got a mucus layer. And above that is a kind of molecular net which catches bacteria and other organisms which happen to come into your lungs. And the mucus is continually moved with these cilia and takes what's been captured away, and we get rid of that. So that's the kind of physical part of the lining of the respiratory system. And then we've got the lining of the gut. And that's not quite so complicated. We just got a layer of cells there, and we're going to be absorbing nutrients and things through those cells. There's a mucus layer, but there's not really any other protection. So these are the defenses boundaries, and these defensive boundaries are patrolled. We have a whole set of cells which are used, or which are involved with defending us, reinforcing those barriers that we have there. And I'm calling these ones here on this slide the standing defense force. So these are the ones which you have from birth, and they deal with more than 98% of organisms which are trying to potentially attack you. They don't require any any learning process in order to do that. They're there, and they are involved in defence. And I'd just like to go through all of the cell types that we've got here. First of all, we've got the sentry cells, and they're located at the barriers. And what they do is they alert when an organism which is attempting to come in, they alert the other part of the defence system that the organism is present, and they signal to them. Then we've got recruitment cells, which respond to these sentries, and they give out chemicals which attract the defenders. And they induce inflammation, so there's a better blood supply there, and healing and things can take place. And then we've got below that the mobile defender cells, and there are over a period of 10 days or so, we produce about 1 trillion of these mobile defender cells, and they're the cells which are highly mobile, and they're recruited to the areas where recruitment cells have indicated that there's a need for them. And they can destroy invading bacteria by engulfing them and disposing of them. And they're the kind of cells which make up if you have pus, then they're the cells which make up the pus. Behind that, we've got patrolling defenders, which destroy invaders. We've got other cells which preserve the integrity of cells. They look around and see if there's any damage to cells, and if there are damaged cells, then they will get rid of them, and then the healing process can take place. And then lastly, there's a group of cells which are involved in protecting against large parasites which can't be engulfed, and producing really toxic chemicals which can kill those larger parasites. So there's a huge standing defence force, and you've all got them, and they are present from birth, and this is the main defence force which is used by babies from birth. In addition to that, we also have protection which requires some learning of what is self and what is non-self. And these are the cells which learn what is self and what is non-self, and they remember it, and they tag things which are non-self and alien, and what you want to get rid of. And then we have other cells which will find those things which have been tagged as non-self, and they will eliminate them. And that is the kind of system which we're always hearing about. It's about the production of antibodies as a consequence of vaccinations. And I want to make it clear here, this is only a very small part of the defence system that we have, yet it's all we tend to hear about. The 99% of our problems are dealt with by the other defence system. So I think that's a really important thing to recognise. One thing that's clear is that this is incredibly complicated, and one of the things I want to emphasise is that we are incredibly complicated, and actually we don't know about most of the things that are going on in our body, and most of the things which are to do with defence. But what we do know is that this defence force clearly needs to be highly coordinated, and these cells need to have some kind of mechanism to be able to transfer information from one cell to another, so that that other cell knows that, oh, there's something here, it needs to be dealt with, for instance. How do cells do that? How do they communicate between one to another and send a very clear message and a very defined message about what needs to be done? Well, they use things which are called exosomes, and exosomes are little packets of information which contain often proteins, and they often contain also the molecules which code for life, DNA and RNA. So DNA is the main code of life that we have in our body and our chromosomes. It's a DNA. RNA we'll have heard lots about, because it is usually the thing which is produced from DNA, and it tells our bodies, it tells them how to make particular proteins. And these exosomes are little packets of information, and they're constructed in a cell. They bud off from the cell and they travel to a neighbouring cell, and they release their contents, they fuse with it and release their contents, and they change the way which the genetic information in that receptor cell is used. So the receptor cell has the same genetic information as the cell which sends the exosome, but the exosome tells it to use that information in a different way. Okay, so it's transferring information, and it's a really, really important part of our communication system within our bodies. And we know not enough about it, but I just wanted to make sure that you knew something about it here. Now, I've told you about the defense system, and the thing I want you to notice here is what is the vulnerability of this defense system? Well, it's all set up to deal with invaders from outside. Okay, so we've got barriers, and we've got a defense system which tries to stop things coming through those barriers. What makes such a system vulnerable? It's vulnerable when organisms are able to be transferred beyond those barriers. And beyond those barriers, we haven't got the sentries, we've got beyond the sentries, and we're left with probably the system which is recognizing sense and self and non-self. So we're particularly vulnerable to pathogenic organisms which are injected into our blood, for instance, by mosquitoes, which inject malaria, for instance, ticks, which inject through the skin into the blood and can send in the Lyme disease bacterium. And then we've also got the bacterium which causes typhus, which is injected through those barriers by lice. And I put at the end there an injection, something that you would use for injection. And what do you do when you're doing a vaccination? Well, you're going right through those defense barriers and putting a whole load of stuff beyond those defense barriers, which are non-self. And this is kind of quite contrary to any understanding of how we should defend our bodies, putting in stuff which is alien to our body beyond these defensive barriers. So anyone advocates of vaccination, they would have to explain to me why it's a good thing to do that. I don't understand why that should be the case. Now, what are the requirements of this defense system? Well, clearly I've told you that at least one of those cells is produced in absolutely enormous numbers. This will require enormous demands on energy and resources to keep this defense system going. There will be competition with other activities that the body's undertaking. It will also require that the communication system we've got there is working okay. If that's disrupted, then we're going to have problems. So what conditions will lead to ineffective defense? Well, I've listed a number of those. Clearly, malnutrition. If you have insufficient nutrition or inappropriate nutrition, you won't have all the resources required to keep up this huge demand for defense. Stress diverts resources elsewhere. If you're under stress, then there'll be less energy available for your defense system. Sleep deprivation. Clearly, this is a very complicated system, and different activities in the defense system will be carried out at different times of the day. And there's very clear evidence that sleep deprivation and having your sleep patterns disrupted reduces your defense system efficiency. There may be lack of specific molecules which are required for that defense system, so lack of vitamin D in the winter months, and people living close to the poles or closer to the poles, and then disruption of the communication system. So all of those things can lead to ineffective defense. And what happens if we have ineffective defense? Well, if we have ineffective defense, then our bodies are open to invasion by organisms which would normally be excluded, and they're not necessarily things which we would associate with disease, but they become a problem if our defenses are compromised. And I just put two samples here. Staphylococcus aureus bacterium can give skin lesions or sinusitis if people's defenses are down. On the right, if we have our defenses are down, then fungi, which are normally not a problem, can cause really skin lesions and lung infections. So those are all consequences of not having your immune system up and running properly. Now I wanted to just look at a little bit about one of these particular defensive boundaries. It's perhaps the most vulnerable. And the reason why I say it's the most vulnerable, this is the gut defensive boundary. The reason why I say it's the most vulnerable is that it's going to be in constant contact with huge numbers of microorganisms. And within the gut, we've got a huge community of microorganisms right up against this barrier. They comprise bacteria, fungi, single-celled animals, and collectively they're called the microbiome. And in a healthy person, with a healthy gut microbiome, there might be up to 1,000 different species. This diversity of organisms is necessary for the digestion, particularly of complex carbohydrates. Humans are well set up for digesting proteins. They're not so well set up for digesting complex carbohydrates, and they often will require the organisms within the microbiome in order to be able to do that. What happens when our food is actually digested? Well, what happens is that often the products of that digestion carried out by these organisms are toxic, and they can't be absorbed immediately by our bodies, or they'd be toxic to our bodies if they were absorbed immediately. So that's a kind of problem, but it's not such a problem because we've got such a diversity of organisms there. The toxic product can be detoxified by another organism, which will only too happily make use of it as a substrate. There's intense competition, of course, between those species, so it's highly likely that they're going to be producing antibiotics so that they're good competitors against everything else which is in there. It's in their interest to survive as well as possible. And at the interface on the boundary there, then the microbes are going to be subject to predation by our defense system. So it's also likely that some of those organisms will have developed chemical signals which will prevent their consumption at that boundary. And they modify, therefore, the operation of the defensive system so they're not engulfed. So there's quite a lot going on at that boundary. Normally that's not a problem if we've got a very diverse set of organisms there and no one organism is there at a very high frequency. But if we lose this diversity within this microbiome, then a number of problems can arise. Now, how can that happen? It can happen through starvation or an inappropriate diet. So we've just got a few food sources, and the microbiome can then become dominated by just a few species. If we've got a species there which happens to produce a toxic product as a consequence of digesting a particular food, and that's the only food that there is present, then we're going to get chronic inflammation of that boundary. Another thing that we might have is that we might have an organism there which is producing these chemicals which modify the defense system, and that might be present there in very high quantity because it's good at digesting whatever small amounts of material are there, and it's not in competition with anything else. And in that case, we can get massive damage to the defense system and to these barriers caused by these particular organisms. And a case in point would be the cholera bacterium. In people with a healthy microbiome, it never gets to a very high frequency in that there, and it doesn't cause problems. But if you have a very unhealthy microbiome, then that's when cholera causes massive loss of water from your system because of the damage that's been done to this barrier. And cholera is caused by typically very, very frequent, say in an industrial revolution when people were actually in a state of starvation, and cholera swept through these communities very, very quickly. But it's been shown that if you have a good microbiome, then cholera is not nearly such a problem. The other thing that will cause our microbiome to become less diverse is use of broad-spectrum antibiotics, which will kill off a large proportion. And here I've got 98% of the microbial species lost after clindamycin treatment. And in that case, if you've removed many of these things, there might be some organism there which is able to survive this antibiotic, and something like Clostridium difficile then may become dominant, and it may then lead to things like colitis. So those are things that can go wrong at this boundary. And what can we do about it? Well, what we need to do is restore the microbiome by changing diet or making sure that we have enough to eat, and also adding the missing components of the microbiome so that they can be restored. We'll never be able to, I think I've seen in sort of advertising, people implying that you could just put back what you wanted in your microbiome. Well, it doesn't work like that. It's a community, and all of the organisms in that community are fighting it out to be there. And what will eventually end up there will be determined by what they've got as substrates, what other competitors there are present. It'll settle down to a new equilibrium, but you can't really determine what that equilibrium will be. Okay, so that's generally about our defense systems. What I want to look at next is there are organisms which have evolved to overcome our defense systems. And these are organisms which have adopted a parasitic lifestyle. And they exploit the resources of the human body despite this defense system. What do you have to do to be successful if you're a parasite? You've got to be able to live for some time at least within a host, and you've got to be able to transmit from that host to a new host. If you're unable to transmit to a new host, that's the end. You won't be a successful parasite. So that's what a parasite's got to do. It's got to reproduce, and it's got to be transmitted to a new host. And the parasites can do this in they can use two different kind of strategies in order to do that. One of them I would call brute force. Okay, so here the parasite goes in, it reproduces very rapidly in the body and causes an enormous amount of damage. And of course the defense system will see it because it's causing all this damage. And so it will be quickly recognized and it will be ejected. And what would we get then? We'd get acute disease, but it would be limited. But an organism like that, which can only stay in the body for a short length of time, it will have to be persistent outside the body for a long period of time if it's going to be successful, and then be able to be transmitted again and have a short burst of reproduction in somebody and then be sent out into the outside world. So that's a kind of brute force strategy. On the other hand, you can be a stealthy parasite, and in that case what your strategy is to have a lengthy residence within the body, slow amounts of reproduction, so that you're not really seen by the defense system, you're unrecognized and you're actually tolerated, and that will cause really rather minimal chronic damage. Such organisms generally will be well adapted to the environment of the body, and they won't be very good at persisting for any length of time outside the body. There are organisms which have conquered that particular problem, but in general they will be not so persistent outside the body as things which use brute force. So different types of parasitic lifestyles. Okay, so what kind of parasites does the human body have? Well, these are perhaps some of the most important ones. I'm dealing with these in terms of how big they are. So these are maybe the biggest parasites, bigger parasites that we have. There's one about 1 centimetre long, and these are the helminth worms. Two types, blood flukes on the left there and filarial worms on the right there. Now these organisms operate by stealth. Blood flukes, they come in, they burrow their way through the skin, and they take residence in the intestines, in the bladder wall, and they give you schistosomiasis. And the filarial worms are spread by mosquitoes, which inject the larvae of the worms. They invade the lymph system and they cause elephantiasis and other disorders. Now, these parasites are found in about a quarter of all humans. So about 2 billion people in the world have these parasites. We don't know very much about them because they're not, you don't find them here. But they are, in terms of, if you were talking about world health problem, this is what you should be looking at. These are really important parasites. How do they operate in the human body? Well, what they do is they actually release packets of information, exosomes, which neutralize the defense system. They neutralize the alarm signals, they suppress the recruitment of defenders, they suppress the inflammatory response, and they promote rapid healing. So they're mimicking what the defense system would normally do, only they're using exosomes to make sure the defense system doesn't see them, and it allows the worms to remain within the body without being detected. And people who are infected with these worms have defense systems which are toned down. Okay, so they're more susceptible to other diseases because their defense system is not working so well because it's been turned down by the presence of these worms in their bodies. The upside is that people who have these worms don't suffer from arthritis and other autoimmune diseases. That's an interesting point about, autoimmune diseases often associated with the defense system attacking your own body. Okay, let's go down a scale. Let's think about organisms which are actually at the scale of micrometers, 5 or 10 micrometers, and have adapted to this parasitic lifestyle. The one on the left is a highly modified bacterium which causes syphilis, a spirochete, and it's also that kind of organism also is responsible for Lyme disease. And on the right, another of these size of parasites would be the malarial parasite. So this is just a single cell organism, and it can live within a single red blood cell. And how do these things operate? Well, they actually hide from the defense system. They do that in the case of the bacterium that causes syphilis. It has a highly modified cell wall, which is not recognized as a bacterium by our defense system because it's been so highly modified. And the bacterium almost lives in very close proximity to cells. In the case of malaria, the coat which the malaria parasite has can be changed very rapidly. And so when the defense system looks at it the first time, it can recognize it. Second time it looks at it, can no longer recognize it because the molecules on its outside have been changed and no longer has the same coat proteins. So these organisms hide from the defensive system, and the other thing to note is that they lack many of the features that you would find in a free-living bacteria. Are able to do all of the metabolic things that you need to do. They have all of the biochemical pathways which are necessary for living freely. These organisms rely on the cells, which they're very, very close to do that for them. They can't live freely. And you will only find them in association with human tissue. So they're dependent on the host for survival. What their difficulty is that they have difficulty in moving to a new host. And in the case of syphilis, then of course intimate contact is required for passing on of the syphilis bacterium. In the case of malaria, then it's red blood cells with the malaria are taken up by mosquitoes and transferred. So that those difficulties are overcome in that case. So I want to now turn to maybe what most controversial kind of entity which might be responsible for being a parasite within the human body. And I want to go down to the level of the molecule now. So what I'm talking about here is a parasitic molecule. And what I'd like to ask is, let's take an organism and let's strip it of everything that's absolutely unnecessary and make a minimalist parasite. What's that minimalist parasite got to do? It's got to be able to exist within the human body, it's got to be able to replicate in some way, and it's got to be able to transmit to another host. So what would a minimalist parasite look like? It would just be a molecule, and it would be a molecule which was capable of replicating in human, and it would be capable of being transferred from that human to another human. Now, what kind of molecules are able to replicate themselves? Well, the only kinds of molecules that can replicate themselves are those which carry genetic information, and they are RNA or they are DNA. If we had a minimalist parasite, it would be a molecule of RNA or DNA which was capable of replicating itself, and it may also need to be protected by some molecules so that when it went to outside environment, it didn't disintegrate before it actually got to another host. Now, what would such a minimalist parasite look like? Well, I would suggest to you that a minimalist parasite like this would look something like an exosome. Many exosomes have got RNA in them, or they've got DNA in them, surrounded by an outer coating of usually something which is derived from a membrane. So a minimalist parasite might well look something like an exosome. Those structures which I talked about, which transfer information from one cell to another. So how could an exosome turn into something that was a parasite? Let's just consider with the normal behavior of an exosome. It's in one cell and it transfers the information to the next cell. It may replicate in that cell in order to increase the signal, and then it will transfer to the next cell. In a normal exosome, what you want to do is that we want that information to travel just to a subset of the cells, not the whole body, but a subset of the correct cells, to give those cells the information they need to use their genetic information appropriately. So that's what a normal RNA or DNA exosome would do. What can we imagine an abnormal exosome might do? Well, suppose that exosome, the DNA in it or the RNA in it changed, and now instead of producing just kind of one or two copies when it gets to the next cell, perhaps it produces loads of copies in the next cell. And so many copies that some of them are released into the environment. So this might be in the lung, and then some of those exosomes might be released into the lung, and they might drift out of the lung. As well as this exosome being transmitted to a huge number of cells, much more than normal. So that would be something which would replicate excessively, and it would tend to cause damage to the cell because it's using many more of the resources of the cell, and it might actually damage it in producing so many copies. And it would also be released into the environment. So there could be, and I'm speculating here, and I'm not telling you that this is the truth, I'm just looking at a particular scenario which might explain how you might get a parasitic, something like a parasitic molecule. So this is just a theory, and it's a possible explanation as to how you might actually get to having a molecule that was like a parasitic molecule, which actually causes some damage. Now, are there any examples that we could think of which might fit this model? So again, we might want to look at different kinds of parasites here. One adopts some sort of brute force operation, something else which operates by stealth. So one which causes a lot of damage quickly, and another one, on the other hand, might cause rather little damage and be present in the body over a very long period of time. So what might fit this bill? The first thing might be something which causes winter vomiting, so-called winter vomiting bug. Winter vomiting bug is associated with an RNA molecule. This RNA molecule rapidly replicates in the gut epithelial cells it produces. It's then included in exosomes. Because it causes so much damage, it's recognized very quickly. But it produces these exosomes, they are released in feces, and they persist for many weeks and months. And people in hospital wards know well about this because they have incredible problems with sterilizing areas where there have been winter vomiting outbreaks. And they're caused by an RNA molecule, as I say. They would be normally called a virus. I'm telling you that, well, you can call it a virus if you want to call it a virus. But I'm telling you that it may be just a modified exosome. Okay. An alternative, so that's something which causes an enormous amount of damage quickly. An alternative would be the chickenpox, again associated with a DNA molecule. And there's a picture of chickenpox. It just looks like an exosome. It's got the DNA is surrounded by a coat of membrane, and chickenpox DNA molecule is present, and it is present for a long time, and it's resident, if you've had chickenpox, it's resident in the nerve ganglia, close to the surface of the skin. It's normally, of course, suppressed by the defense system once it comes in. It infects children who are naive and never seen it before. But if your defense system is down, then it will break out again, and that's the time when you get shingles. So again, this looks like an exosome which has sort of gone a bit haywire. But it's got a niche now. It can live in your body once you've got it, it'll be there for the rest of your life. And it can be detected in your body for the rest of your life in the nerve ganglia. So that, again, the chickenpox would be called a virus. And I have a reason to think that, these are things which have ultimately evolved from exosomes, things which are a normal part of our body and the way in which our body operates. So what are coronaviruses? We've heard about coronaviruses ad nauseam for the last 4 years. My hypothesis from a lot of reading and so on is that actually coronaviruses are likely to be DNA sequences which are present in exosomes, and they're part of the normal cell signaling system. But they have been co-opted by the people who want us to be scared into the category of virus. So these are things which are normally there, and they are RNA sequences in exosomes. They're part of the normal cell signaling system, but they have been misinterpreted, shall we say, giving them some leeway as so-called viruses. How do we know that these things are there? What we do is, if you want to find a coronavirus, and the coronavirus, as I say, is just one of these exosomes with RNA in it, you can detect that by grinding up whatever organism, whatever tissue you want to look at, and you can extract the RNA, and then you can turn it into DNA. RNA is usually very labile, and it's not possible to actually isolate that DNA and that RNA for any length of time. So when people work on these things, what they do is that they grind up the tissue, get the RNA out, turn it into DNA, and then they make lots and lots of copies of that DNA, stick them all together so that you've got the complete sequence, and then we've got a DNA copy of these exosome RNA, and that's called an infectious clone. And if people are working with these viruses and they want to do some experiments with them, then it's the DNA copy of these RNA viruses which they use to do their experiments. They can't do the experiments with the RNA because they can't isolate it. They have to use this method in order to get something which they can then infect something with. And if you treat an organism with huge numbers of copies of RNA, which is supposed to be a signaling molecule, then you're going to cause problems. It's not surprising. You're going to screw up the transmission systems of your cells, and you're going to cause some sort of disease. And people do experiments like that, and they get these infectious clones, and they treat whatever organism it is with these infectious clones, and it screws them up. But that's completely artificial. And I don't believe that coronaviruses are in any way the same thing as a virus, and I think that we've been completely brainwashed to believe that they are viruses and that they're really dangerous. And those exosome sequences don't have any capacity to replicate and travel around the world at high speed, as where people say they do. So I think this is this lies at the heart of the whole of the COVID-19 nonsense. It's a fabrication. It's a complete illusion that there is a deadly disease that's been spread around the world. The science doesn't support it in any shape or fashion. Yet there are people out there calling themselves experts who are saying that that's what happened. And you'll see it everywhere. If they say that, don't trust them, because they're just spinning a story. They're supporting that story and they're all telling the same lie. And I guess what we need to do is to tell people that this has all been an illusion and this is all a lie. And the biology does not support what they're saying. So that's my take on what coronaviruses are. So just a few conclusions. We've evolved to live in intimate contact and tolerate the presence of a huge diversity of potentially damaging organisms and even parasitic molecules. And we possess very highly evolved and very sophisticated defense systems, and far more sophisticated than anything you'll ever hear from a Bill Gates. And actually, we remain largely ignorant about the level of sophistication. And your bodies are fantastic. They're wonderful, wonderful things. And you should never be told that you're a vulnerable person. You are an amazing, amazing person, the culmination of so much fantastic evolution, the summit of it. And you should always remember that. And if people are telling you stories about, you're inadequate, just tell them to bugger off. Remaining healthy requires us really to understand a bit more about our bodies and how to look after them properly, and how to that we have this amazing defense system. Don't screw it up. Live in a way in which it will be supported. That's the way to healthy living, in my opinion. It's not through injections or somehow enhancing what utter arrogance to say that somebody could enhance what has taken millions of years of evolution to create. The hubris among the scientific community is just off the scale. And the last thing I'd like to say, that you shouldn't worry about any threat from any engineered organisms. They'll be talking about disease X. Well, you'll know full well that they can't produce anything. Our bodies are well capable of dealing with whatever they throw at us. They've been trying for ages and ages to do it. They didn't manage it, and so they had to create the illusion of it. And that's what's happened over the last 4 years. There is no molecules that are capable of causing a deadly global pandemic. Now, what I'd like to do is to acknowledge a certain person who is an absolutely fantastic teacher. He's called J.J. Cooey, and he runs from his garage. He runs this Gigome Biological, and he's taught me so much. And I'm really indebted, and really I should, a lot of this, especially the bit on viruses and what a virus is, comes from what he has taught me. And I would thoroughly recommend that you have a look at his site. He does kind of 2 hour, he goes on even longer than I do. He gives a kind of session every day for a couple of hours. And if you've seen 1 or 2 of those, can bring you up to speed on what's really been happening. And I'd just like to acknowledge him as contributing to this talk. So thank you very much for your attention.